Welcome to the second part of Bottomline Africa. We're glad you've stayed with us. Of course, this is your favorite Pan-African show. And tonight, before our discussion tonight in studio, which has everything to do with the human rights in the continent, that is Africa, let me go through a story here from Ethiopia. And veteran Ethiopian opposition figure Merera Gudina says the country's government needs to hold negotiations with the country's most popular opposition parties or risk the return of destabilizing protest. He spoke only days after leaving prison. Now Merera is the only prominent opposition politician in Ethiopia to be freed since Prime Minister Haile Mariam Desalegn, who announced earlier this month that his administration would release an unspecified number of the many dissidents jailed in that country. Now, the announcement came amid continued anti-government unrest in Ethiopia, despite authorities ending a 10-month state of emergency last year and ongoing dialogue between the government and opposition groups. Well, unfortunately, we couldn't get that soundbite from Gudina, but we have our guest with us in the studio. We have George Kegoro with me in studio, is the Kenya Human Rights Commission Executive Director. Also joining me live from Diani, that is the coastal city of Mombasa, is Mr. Fiseha Tekle. He is a representative of Amnesty International Ethiopia Program. Good evening, gentlemen, and welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So let me begin with Fiseha. Now, Fiseha, you've seen or you've heard that report from Ethiopia. You know, the Ethiopian authorities there releasing some of the political detainees in Ethiopia. And of course, Gudina, who is a major political figure in Ethiopia, they're saying that the government should negotiate with the opposition. First of all, is this a sign, you know, that Haile Mariam government are trying to loosen its grip on the opposition?
It's the release of prisoners of conscience, which happened last week,
yes,
was significant, especially in terms of increasing the political space in the country. And Amnesty welcomes it because, well, we are expecting that it's the first step. But we expect that all prisoners of conscience in Ethiopia will be released.
Yeah. So Fiseha, what does this mean? What does this mean for Ethiopia moving forward? Do we expect to see even more prisoners released?
Yes, of course. In Ethiopia, we have more than thousands of prisoners of conscience. Maybe the prominent one is Dr. Marara, but we have many others who are still in prison, who are in prison for crimes which they didn't commit.
Yes.
So we expect that this will be followed by many more releases.
Yes. Now, George, what informed this discussion actually is what is transpiring, what is happening in Ethiopia at the moment. But I'm sure you have an experience when it comes to human rights issues, and various reports have been quoted stating that most, human rights abuses still occur under the oversight of the state. So where will this leave the victims?
I think there's a regional trend within Africa of the underlying problem within the countries that are in trouble is political struggles for political power. In Ethiopia, that struggle has been shut for some time since the 2008 election, when they similarly jailed opposition figures and then charged them with treason and genocide, and have done so in the subsequent elections. You've seen the same problems in Burundi, where after the expiry of his 2 terms, Nkurunziza unilaterally changed the rules of the game and gave himself a 3rd term and is planning to formalize that. You've seen that in the same busting of term limits in Rwanda. You've seen that the same problem in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where after the expiry of his 2 terms,
yes,
Kabila is unable to organize an election that would create his exit. And you've also seen Uganda has passed not only the term limits, but it has also come down to age limits, where Museveni has, in anticipation of the fact that he will hit the upper age limit allowed by the constitution, has already gone out of the way to clear the way to stay in power indefinitely. So at the bedrock of all these human rights abuses,
yes,
is a struggle for power within the region, which is evidenced by attempts, successful so far, to remain in power indefinitely.
Yes. Now, George, allow me to return back to Ethiopia once again. We're going to talk about Kenya also shortly. Now, Feseha, there are reports that have been widely published. In November 2015, apparently demos erupted in the Oromia, Amhara, and the southern nations in regional states in Ethiopia. And then, apparently, Ethiopian authorities, routinely responded to legitimate and, largely peaceful expressions of dissident by this opposition with, excessive force, resulting to, deaths of about 800 people then. So how is the situation like in Ethiopia now? Because from this report, it seems, this is a country that is in a sorry state.
There must be some correction to the numbers, because that's 800 is data we had before a year. After that, we had a lot of information about the killing of peaceful protesters. That happened last week on Saturday.
Yes.
Where 5 people were killed when attending a religious festival in Amhara region in North Wallo. So this is ongoing, and the number of people who have died as a result of this demonstration has increased. But in general, the situation in Ethiopia is dire. It's not only about demonstrations, people expressing their grievances by walking on the street, but also there is political tension within the coalition government.
Yes.
There are some indications of ethnic violence happening each and every other place.
Yes.
Unprecedented level of evictions have happened in Somali region of Ethiopia, especially targeting the Oromos. So it's not only about the opposition, it's happening throughout the country, and what's really happening is a bit dire.
Yes. Now, Feseha, I'm sure you'll agree with me that most of these cases go unreported. So the main question is, why has Ethiopia remained such a closed state? I mean, such a closed country? Because apparently reports indicate that there are restrictions to civil societies and independent media. I mean, they couldn't even allow some, UN officials, special rapporteurs, entry into that country. Why has Ethiopia remained such a closed country?
Well, the official restriction is that the official explanation is that Ethiopia is a sovereign and has a history of independence, so we are not we don't let others to interfere in our internal affairs. But the genuine explanation is that the government wants to monopolize the political space, so they are not letting any critical voices to come into the country or to go out of the country. So the government is blocking information coming out of the country, and also blocking others from conducting independent investigation.
And I'm sure that is what is giving
space.
the opposition their very hard time. Now, George, let me return you back to Kenya for once. And apparently there's a tweet from Amnesty Kenya here saying that human rights organizations and defenders joined the family of Robert Kirotich from the Sengwer indigenous people of the Embubut forest during his burial today. This is a man who was shot by the Kenya Forest Service. And George, after that incident, the European Union suspended Kenya water conservation funding, which runs up to 3.6 billion shillings. This is something that could have been avoided, right?
Yeah, what has been going on in Mbobut requires some independent light to shine on it. There are, of course, consequences when you've got that kind of human rights situation that is being reported in that part of the world, of the country. And after some prevarication, we are grateful that the EU has acted quickly and decisively in indicating that it is a serious problem for people to be shot in the manner that has happened there. What we hope is that there can be a full and independent investigation, and the root cause of why evictions are happening can be established, and those who are affected can be compensated and or given some kind of legal redress.
Yes. Now, George, EU has already, of course, suspended its support for Kenya with regards to the water conservation. Now, with Ethiopia again, they continue to enjoy a lot of support from these foreign aid and donors. Are you seeing some situation of double standard? Because there's some people who are complaining here on Twitter.
Yeah, I mean, those accusations or that point is made a lot, and the answer usually revolves around how Ethiopia and Kenya are viewed in terms of other interests that foreign powers have in the region. Ethiopia and Kenya are viewed as stabilizing governments in the war against terror in the Horn of Africa region, and therefore that the fact that the two countries have got cooperating governments in a matter of strategic importance for foreign powers that have interest in this part of the world, that is traditionally viewed as the reason why they go soft on the region's human rights abuses.
Yes. Now, Faseha, I'm sure you'll agree with me that one thing that is very much common in most African countries, where, violation of human rights have been widely recorded, is that, judiciary is normally not independent. Do you think this is something that is giving, is some sort of a major obstacle in Ethiopia, for instance?
Yes, I mean, in every democracy, the independence of the judiciary is one important anchor. But that's not really the case in Ethiopia, because the ruling party has managed to erode the power of the judiciary by promulgating abusive laws or regressive laws to the power of the judiciary. You can see it in the case of the anti-terrorism law, which restricts power of the judiciary, the kind of evidence that can be presented, that can be admissible to the court, things like that. So in Ethiopia, the government was able to restrict the power of the judiciary in a way which is comfortable to the government.
Yes.
In addition to that, we can also poke at some issues in relation to the way the judges are being appointed, and after appointment, how they function, are they really independent, and things like that. So, yeah, all of those things have contributed for erosion of the judicial power to maintain human rights in the country.
Yes. Now, George, let's talk about the African Commission on Human Rights. Of course, this is a body which has been tasked with promoting and protecting human rights in the continent. How would you rate them, or how effective are they in the first place?
I think the Africa Commission is one of the mechanisms for the protection of human rights within the African continent. But even before you talk about the specific human rights mechanisms within the African continent, you've got to start with how the leadership within the African Union views human rights. Article 4 of the Constitutive Act, of the AU Constitutive Act, was a deliberate attempt to move away from the OAU situation of hear no ill and non-interference with the internal affairs of other countries, and particularly a laissez-faire attitude towards human rights violations. You don't have a strong leadership, political leadership within the African Union about human rights. You've had a significant backlash by the AU in particular, where other mechanisms, for example, the International Criminal Court, have intervened in situations very similar to the ones that we are describing in this show, where human rights abuses occurred and crimes were committed. For example, the situation in Kenya, the situation in Darfur. So that is an early political indication that the specialized human rights mechanisms like the Africa Commission, their space is very significantly circumscribed if they try to follow specific human rights abuses or specific human rights violations within the continent.
Yes.
There isn't sufficient political support for a human rights culture.
And I'm sure, George, you'll agree with me that there's some governments in Africa who have been targeting, civil society groups, human rights commissions like yours. What do you think needs to be done to stop this?
Yusuf, what we've got in Africa is governments trying to stay in power, to monopolize political power and political space using whatever means that they can get away with. When it is possible, they will create many pretenses of democratic practice that legitimize them in power, which is what has happened in Uganda over the years. When that became impossible, more recently in the last election, then Museveni forced his way in a very naked way into an extra term, and now he has forced his way into what will become an unlimited presidency. So at the heart of the human rights crisis is the fact that democracy is not working. We don't have an agreement within African countries that people should about how to access political power peacefully and hand it over to competitors in if the group in power is defeated following free and fair elections.
Yes.
Unless we fix that, we can never solve these problems that we are talking about.
And I know your commission was also targeted some time back by the NGO board, apparently?
That's correct, and we understood that to be, again, an attempt to monopolize political space.
Yes.
The attack against the Kenya Human Rights Commission, there have been actually several attacks in the last 2 years or so, all of them completely unjustified, all of them with only one aim, to delegitimize the commission. And the reason why the commission is being delegitimized has got to do with these continued commitments to monopolizing political space. You ensure that those that try to participate and offer independent views about what should be happening within the political space are silenced and are not able to participate within the political space. That is a strategy for for remaining in power. That is a strategy for ensuring that your hold onto power is not threatened.
Yes, allow me to engage Fesea once again. And Fesea, earlier we did pose this question to our viewers. We did ask them if they're satisfied with Africa's progress in securing human rights. And Alice Kemunto says, until we get rid of dictatorship and allow freedom of expression, it will be difficult to make any progress. Fesea, do you agree, without necessarily talking about Ethiopia? I'm sure it's a country that you're still working in. Do you think this is a solution to the human rights violation we're witnessing in the continent?
Yes, I agree with that because human rights, it's natural for the people in power to seek to stay in power unlimitedly. But resistance within the country is the key to solve that problem. So African states need to realize that they have to have the acceptance, genuine acceptance of their people in order to stay in power. And they have to abide by democratic rules. So democratic institutions are not there for format or for pretense, but they are there to work. So if you see the case in Ethiopia, we have all the institutions, but they are dysfunctional. So the people, by mobilizing, by resisting these moves by the government to restrict freedom, to restrict criticism, to restrict fair and equitable election, they have to remind the government that they cannot do those things.
Yes.
So I think what's really important is that the internal pressure, and what's happening in Ethiopia is that's a real example for that.
Well, Said Fasea, for that comment. And George, as you make your final comment, there's a court here, the African Human Rights Court, apparently, that most people don't know about. Apparently, the 54 countries in Africa, only 30 recognize the court. I mean, what does that mean?
It just means a lack of commitment to the mechanisms that the African people or the African governments put in place and which are supposed to guarantee the protection of human rights. We've had the existing African court. It's a long story that cannot easily be summarized, but we are having recently a move to expand the jurisdiction of the court to include a capacity to try atrocity crimes of the kind that we're discussing in this program. And that is also, a story that is still developing and is really essentially part of the backlash that we've had within the African continent against the ICC because of the interventions that it has made in certain countries. I think what is needed within the African continent, given the governance crisis that we face around many of these countries, given we've got a low-scale civil war going on in Burundi, we've had a major open conflict that has been going on in South Sudan for the last 3 years, and so on and so forth. I think Africa needs to step back and Africans need to step back and ask themselves, are the mechanisms that they've put in place working for them? Obviously, they're not working for them. What else is needed? People need to find a way of living together, and the only way to live together is to agree on a common set of rules and agree on ways to enforce those rules in good faith, rather than the pretenses that we have going on around our countries that then break down and lead to the generalized violence that we've described in this show.
Well said, George. Many thanks for your input. Of course, that is George Kegoro, is the Kenya Human Rights Commission Executive Director. And earlier, joining me all the way from Diani along the Kenyan coast is Mr. Fiseha Tekle, who is a representative of Amnesty International Ethiopia Program. And of course, this particular debate is informed by the fact that Ethiopia has released a couple of, political detainees, and one of them, who is a key opposition figure, Merera Gudina, says the country's government needs to hold negotiations with the country's most popular opposition parties or risk the return of destabilizing protest. I'm going to go through some of your tweets shortly with regards to our Twitter poll that we had posted earlier. But for now, a group of vulnerable Ugandan children formed the Watoto choir recently, traveled to the UK for 6 months, raising money for other children like themselves and offering a unique experience in far-off countries. And here is part of their performance during their UK tour. Take a look. course, that report there forms images of the day. Let's now take a look at a proverb. Interesting proverb there from Nigeria. And before we wrap up, earlier on a Twitter poll, we did ask you if you are satisfied with Africa's progress in securing human rights. And 24% of you said yes, and a whopping 76% of you said no. At Alice Kamuto says, until we get rid of dictatorship and allow freedom of expression, it will be difficult to make any progress. At Sudi Kev says, Africa's progress as a collective is hard to give it a thumbs up or down. Individual countries, yes, some are making major strides with majority women legislatures removing the death penalty, yet some lag, especially in women's and children's rights and freedoms of assembly and speech. And then at Vince says, where people cannot demand their rights without fear of death by so-called alleged police killing and trumped up allegations. And one sign at Vince still says, if such progress prevails, then oppressive leaders will have no room in countries like Kenya. Very interesting comment there. Many thanks for your feedback. Of course, this has been Bottomline Africa. Remember, this show is aired every Monday to Thursday from 10 to 11 p.m. Until tomorrow, same place, same time. Bye-bye and enjoy the rest of the evening.